Hello, everyone. I'm Ivo Daalder, president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, our weekly look at news from around the world. And a lot of news there is. 6 months of war in Ukraine. We'll take a look at where we've come from and where we're going. Then we'll examine heat around the world. A rapidly changing climate is leading to droughts all over the place, including riverbeds that are no longer have any water reservoirs that are emptying out, whether it's in Europe or the United States or in China. We're seeing climate change in action and having to figure out how to live with it. And then finally, we'll take a look at what happens when a young prime minister decides to go dancing one evening, and what the fallout from that is politically in Finland as well as in other places. Here to talk about all of this today with us are Karen DeYoung, who is the associate editor and senior national security correspondent of the Washington Post. She joins us from Washington. Karen, great to have you.
Thank you. Always good to be here.
And from Provincetown, Ryan Heath, who is the editor of Global Insider at Politico. Brian, great to have you.
Hi, everyone.
And from Munich, Germany, just back from Norway, Stefan Kornelius, who is the political editor of the Süddeutsche Zeitung. Stefan, always good to have you back here as well.
Hello from Europe.
Karen, let's start with you. The Post and you, among the reporters, have done a series of articles about the war, both the run up to it, the mistakes that have been made by the Russians and others. Now that we are 6 months into a war that Vladimir Putin thought was going to take 6 days, how wrong he was. But here we are. The war seems to be grinding on. There are growing dangers, including a fire at a nuclear plant just the other day. I'll give you the unenviable task of summarizing sort of where we are in this war and what we need to look forward to as we think about the days, weeks, and months ahead.
Thanks, Ivo. Well, I think, in terms of summarizing, we can just summarize this week, which has been a really busy week, even though in terms of who's winning, nothing really changed. But a lot of things happened this week. As you mentioned, of course, this was the 6-month anniversary of the war that started on February 24th with the Russian invasion. It also was Ukrainian Independence Day. The biggest sort of focus of attention this week was on the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, which is the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe. It supplies 20% of all of Ukraine's power. There has been shelling back and forth. It's occupied by the Russians, although still operated by its Ukrainian workers. There has been a lot of explosions around it, which the Russians have blamed on the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have blamed on the Russians. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, has been raising alarms that there could be a nuclear catastrophe if some of these shells actually hit something that would cause a radioactive explosion. The Security Council held a meeting on it this week, where again, basically the Russians and the Ukrainians just traded charges against each other. The IAEA has demanded a visit, and they're negotiating over whether to have a visit, which I think is probably actually going to happen next week. The question is, do the Russians have to leave to have a visit? In other words, just demilitarize the place, which they've refused to do. Now it seems to be coming down to whose reporters get to cover the thing. Does Moscow get to have journalists there? They're having what seem to be pretty ridiculous arguments over it. Yesterday, the power plant went off the grid, sort of scared everybody. It's back on now, but who knows for how long. So that's a focus of attention. In Washington, President Biden authorized another $800 million drawdown. I think that was the 19th announcement of U.S. aid. This is drawdowns from existing U.S. military stocks. He also said that he would take $3 billion from the big package for Ukraine aid that was approved by Congress a few months ago and use that to buy more weapons from U.S. defense contractors for Ukraine. And what's interesting about this is that these are the kinds of weapons that will allow Ukraine to sort of shoot at shorter distances than the long artillery that we sent them a couple of months ago, which itself was the subject of a big argument and seemed to indicate that these are in preparation for a Ukrainian offensive that the Ukrainian government keeps saying is coming into the east and the south, where the Russians are occupying. President Putin announced he was growing the size of the Russian military by 137,000, I think, which makes it a total of about 1.15 military, still a little bit short of the size of the U.S. military active duty, but 4 times as big as the Ukrainian active duty. So what we're in now is what everybody talked about is a war of attrition. And what we thought, the Russians thought at the beginning was going to last a few days, others thought would last a few months. Now looks like it's going to last a whole lot longer than that.
Yeah, it looks like a grinding war that, frankly, no one had foreseen, and I think the balance of power that you talked about, just in sheer manpower, would suggest that the Russians had the upper hand, and somehow that hasn't quite happened. Ryan, I wonder if you want to add anything, but also talk a little bit about what is maybe happening inside Russia in terms of how this war is playing out in Russia. Karen mentioned the increase in manpower, but no mobilization, which is kind of interesting. And then, of course, there was this really terrible incident of a car bomb of a young journalist, a right-wing nationalist young journalist, the daughter of one of the great propagandists of Russian imperialism, Alexander Dugin, and where that was coming from. So what's happening in Russia is there staying power? We spent a lot of time talking about the West, and we'll come back to that in a minute, but is there sufficient staying power in Russia for this war of attrition?
So many things to say. Journalist is a very generous label for Daria Dugina, the woman who was killed in that.
Sorry, that's true. Okay.
Propagandist,
commentator on TV.
Propagandist on journalism programs, maybe I could let you get away with. I think that there are increasing acts of desperation. So Karen mentioned this mobilization of 137,000 troops. So he has to find them. He has to sign them up. There isn't a conscription order yet. There isn't a general mobilization. So presumably he will be able to find some of those potential troops among minorities and poor populations at Russia's fringes, but it's not a given that there's 137,000 people that will walk into a recruitment center and sign up at all. I think that the killing of Daria Dugina is a bit of a warning shot against the people who have been criticizing Putin from his right. And there are people like Alexander Dugin who do that, who want this general mobilization. So I think that Putin is worried about the state of the war. I think he's worried about his ability to control public opinion. He's clamping down on more and more people, even Jewish immigration organizations now finding themselves banned inside Russia. And, I don't have any facts to add to the case, but another Putin critic falls out of a building in Washington, D.C., and I find that a bit of a coincidence as well. So, there are long tentacles everywhere, and the tentacles unfurl themselves in desperation, and that's my read of the situation at the moment.
Stefan, 6 months ago, Europe was importing lots of gas and oil and coal from Russia. Business was going on. Nobody thought there was going to be a war. Even the day before the war started, a senior European foreign minister talked to Tony Blinken, and Blinken said, well, you got to be ready. It's coming. And the guy said, well, you're still on that thing? It's not happening. He, by the way, called the next day to apologize. But it's a very different Europe today. How can we, how do we think about this? Is there enough staying power? Is the change that we saw on the 24th, the 25th of February still there, even if there is significant hardship coming with the coming winter and the less energy than people are used to? How should we think about Europe today, 6 months after this war started?
It's quite simple. I think Europe is locked in indefinitely. There's no way out. You can't turn it around. There was a little minor thing today. Some wingish social democrats in the German regional side appealed to Chancellor Scholz to make a sort of serious attempt to go for peace, to negotiate, not to deliver weapons anymore. And I was thinking, even if Scholz would do that, he would be totally isolated, wouldn't lead anywhere. So there is no force in Europe who can turn this around. The moral slump from what happened, the outrageousness of that war in comparison to sort of the idea of finding peace now, finding it at a standstill, is unthinkable. And Zelensky this week was clear enough in saying, well, we want to regain our country. We want to drive them out, even that far, and said Crimea is the ultimate goal. So here we are. There is no peace in sight. There is no political idea on how to continue in this, even though the Turkish President Erdogan is having high hopes in being some kind of mediator in this game, since he was a bit of successful in the crane deal from late July. He has some domestic issues and some hopes pinning to his re-election campaign starting soon. But putting all of this aside, the impact of this war is now really hitting Europe in the West as well. Politics is returning these days into office. The major issue in all countries, Spain, Italy, Germany, most of all, is how do we get over that winter? How do we cope with energy shortages? How do we react to price hikes? How do we shield the poor and those who can't afford it from these huge demands which will be there? I mean, the market probably will supply this kind of needed energy, but it will come at a price. And this is now a negotiation on how to fend this off, who takes the burden. And Germany, for example, is utterly messed into this debate right now. We have a cacophony of opinion and voices of what can be done. The coalition is shattered in this. They're totally split. And I'm really looking forward to next week, where this all will flare up. And I think we'll see a lot of political blood being spilled in a lot of countries. Britain has this extremely sharp debate, and you should think, well, the British should have gas and oil from the North Sea, but they don't. So in the end, to sum it up, the war is coming home to the Europeans now.
So, but just to press you on that, Stefan, I think that's right. The war is coming home, but at the same time, the issue is about how to distribute pain as opposed to how to change the fundamental trajectory of war. That is, it's an internal political debate about the distribution of who carries what, as opposed to, which it seems to be is the fear in the United States, that somehow there will be a big peace effort and everything will fall apart in terms of Western unity. You don't see that.
Well, I mean, Putin's effort in actually preventing us from getting this gas, and he's again shutting down Nord Stream 1 in next week or over the weekend for 3 days, assumingly, and I'm sure it won't get back. As we speak, we see huge flame rises in the border to Finland, where Russia is burning gas, which was designed to go to the West. It's like a symbol of what he's withholding. The effect is that the European governments are apart, that there is no unity in how to deal with that domestically. And the more the pressure grows, the more there will be domestic voices appealing for, let's do some kind of peace, let's withdraw the weapon pledges to Ukraine, let's try to get out of this, let's try to accommodate Putin. I don't think it will hold, but nevertheless, it will need a lot of political effort to keep that pressure on. That might fall back to the Americans as well. But what I'm most surprised of, and this is what basically leads back to Karen, we're talking about the weapons, and this war will still be decided on what kind of weapons are there and how the war will be fought militarily. What the Ukrainians do need now to stop that kind of attrition, this kind of grinding situation, is much more advanced offensive weapons, and they don't have them. And we're not willing to deliver that. So what's the political idea? Is it to bring it to a standstill here and just to see who blinks first? I don't get it. So I think we need to have this debate in the fall and how to advance politically while not losing militarily.
Karen, just back to you on just what Stefan said. I think I heard from a very senior American official this week that the next 6 months will have a slowdown in weapons delivery compared to the first 6 months, not because there's no willingness to do so, but there's just not enough left. The stockpiles are depleted on the U.S. case, and the production isn't there to fill it in. And the same is true for many of our European friends who've basically given what there is to give for now.
Well, I think the supply chain problems that have affected every industry have also affected the defense industry. A lot of this stuff that's coming off the shelf from these drawdowns, that's stuff that's just being taken from U.S. defense stocks that's already sitting there. They saw it with Stingers and with Javelins, where they just basically started to run out of them. The new money, the $3 billion, as I said, is for actually purchasing stuff from the defense industry. A lot of that stuff doesn't exist right now. And this is a pretty long-term plan. I think that in terms of the ammunition and stuff, they can keep sending ammunition, but a lot of these more sophisticated air defense systems, tow missiles, it's going to be quite a while, months, if not even years, before they can send this stuff over. So that's a problem. In terms of the Europeans, if you look at who's sending what, the United States far and away is the biggest supplier of weaponry. And I think that in some ways with a lot of the Europeans, it's more symbol than substance. And I agree with Stefan that it'll cause a political problem if the Europeans start to get cold feet about this. I'm not sure it will actually cause a weapons problem, because there still is very strong support, political support here in the United States. If nothing else, you've got the opposition, the right, saying, "Why aren't you giving more?" So I think that they're trying to gird for the long term, and Stefan's correct that in Europe they're starting to say, "Wait a minute, how can we continue that?" I'm not sure that will lead to negotiations, because I don't think the Russians want to have negotiations over this.
No, and let me just add, I think that, the same supply problems are happening in space. On the Russian side, of course, they may have enough World War II artillery shells to keep lobbing as they want, but they don't have a lot of other stuff. Their precision-guided munitions are in short supply, which is why they're now buying Iranian drones as a way to at least get some capabilities that they otherwise wouldn't have. And the export controls that are really starting to bite is preventing the rebuilding of the Russian military, at least the sophisticated part of the military. And that's unlikely to change, which is, I think, why we're likely to be back 6 months from now. And perhaps the situation on the ground will be slightly different from what it is, but it looks like we will be able to come back at the 1 year mark in early February and talk about how this war of attrition is still going on, and whether debate about Western unity will hold, will still be there. At least that would be my bet at this point. But we will come back to that at another time. Now, I want to shift over, Stefan, to the Rhine, the lifeline for much of German industry in Western Germany. Was almost without water. Ships had to be offloaded in order to come through and deliver from the ports in Rotterdam into Germany. We're seeing a massive heat wave in China, 75 days going, where I believe night temperatures are 95 degrees Fahrenheit, close to 40 degrees centigrade. In the United States, the Colorado River is emptying out, and the U.S. government has told Arizona to cut water use by 20%, fires, drought affecting agriculture, including in Europe and particularly. This is not just a one-time crisis, as we've just seen. I think the headline in the New York Times today was we had 5 1-in-1,000-year rainstorms in 5 weeks in this part of the world. So this is the new normal. How is that going to work out for not only in Europe, but in the rest of the world?
It looks like the new normal. It's not the first summer we experienced that, but it's getting more severe by every year. We do have those heat waves followed by torrential rains. We just see Pakistan being flooded, or parts of Pakistan with worse than we've seen that ever. China, you just mentioned, it goes all the way to Texas, where we see a tremendous heat wave and followed by torrential floods. We have vast places in Europe which are declared drought zones. Drought zones. So basically, the southern ring of Europe is sort of engulfed in a heat wave, which is not disappearing. It's now late August. It's 5:20 p.m. in Munich. It's almost 90 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 in Celsius, which is unusual here. So we all feel it. We all see it. It's changing our lives. It's coming in terms of water supply. Simple things that pools in Italy have to be emptied and irrigation systems are shut off. We have protests in France where ordinary farmers go against the government, which helps country club and golf club owners to irrigate their patches of green. So here we are. This is hitting society, and it will definitely impact the world in a broader scheme in terms of food security, in terms of harvest security, in terms of long-term water supply. It changes our behavior and how we collect water, keep water from those torrents which come down, but much less frequent than we were used to. And it brings in the immediate demand to change our habits and to change our environmental and energy consumption habits. I just returned from Norway for a vacation, where 95% of the country lives off water-powered electricity. You have more than 50% of the country driving electrical vehicles. All ferries are driven electrically. This is sort of a model country in how to change it, but it's a small country in a certain climate area, 4.5 million people, lots of money from its vast national funds, which surprisingly are funded by oil and gas. And they keep selling this because this is helping their domestic change program. But not all of us have this luxury. So we're all wondering how we can change politically and in terms of our energy consumption as quickly as we can. California this week announced to get rid of oil-driven vehicles by 2035. A lot of European countries have similar, at least political pledges. Not all are implemented by law, but it will definitely it will be unavoidable to even speed that goal up. And actually, here the circle closes in what we talked about earlier on Russia and energy and gas. Now the race is on in Europe to supply energy from other sources. Huge investments are being done to get, for example, liquid gas into Europe. Harbors are being built, ships are being built. The German chancellor and the energy minister were just both in Canada, paying a visit to the Canadian government and agreeing on a hydrogen project, which is hugely water consuming, but nevertheless, they agreed on it. So we're searching sort of like uncontrolled for different sources of energy and trying to steer their ship around in the right direction. But in terms of tempo, in terms of speed, which is necessary, and the pressure which is on due to other conflicts, like the war, which we talked about, this is a huge, complex operation, and I'm not sure whether governments are up to that task at this time. You're muted.
Sorry, Ryan. I think Stefan is exactly correct that there is a, I think the Mother Earth is crying out and said, do something in some ways. And the question is, are societies and governments able to adapt quickly enough to deal with the challenge that is there? If you take China, the adaptation is let's burn more coal in order to deal with the problem of not having enough energy to have air conditioning or water being pumped or what have you. Frankly, that's true even in other countries, including in the United States and in Europe, where the first instance tends to be let's do more fossil fuel. Exactly the wrong way around, so that we can sprinkle our golf courses. Can you imagine if we have the kind of debate we had in the United States as is happening in France about golf courses? That would be remarkable. But so how do we get the kind of consensus that we need in our own countries to move forward in the way that Stefan suggested is increasingly necessary?
I don't think consensus is the threshold to aim for. You need something less than that to take action, and it's urgent enough to be satisfied with whatever that less than consensus is. But like, I'm someone that literally grew up using the washing water on the garden because we had water bans throughout our entire childhood in Australia, and that was 35 years ago. So we'd had warnings about this. And we can do whatever we want quick enough if we want it. Like, you put someone on the moon, you can figure out how to do renewable energy. Like, it's a matter of political will. It's not a matter of capability. But that said, it's not just amazing innovations. Like, you need a regulatory foundation. And that is my lesson from covering climate in Europe. However flawed Germany's energy strategy might be, however much they might be falling short of some of their net zero trajectories, there has been decades of planning, the sort of planning and funding that is only now about to occur in the US with the passing of the Inflation Reduction Act. But success and change is possible when you do all of that work. And I do see that we're at a tipping point in how we talk about these things as well. We start to see all of these weather events not as individual tragedies or disasters, but as connected things. It's a weather ecosystem. And we're starting to see that in the drama around the events caused by climate change. And the way we talk about water security and food security now, it needs to be in those security terms for people to understand and take urgent action, and for it to be elevated to the highest, hardest levels of policy making. So I think that it's possible to succeed, but it's just an uphill struggle, and you have to grasp at whatever tools you can. One thing that has worried me this week, final thought, Texas has tried to ban, or has banned, 10 companies and 349 investment funds because they are considered to be boycotting fossil fuels, and virtually none of them are actually doing that. They just care about environmental and social factors in their investment practices. And it's getting to the point where you would be breaching your fiduciary duty as a board member or someone in a senior executive role to not be thinking about these environmental factors when you make financial investments. So I find that lawmaking insane in Texas. Like, it's ultimately going to end up in courts because it's incompatible with good corporate governance.
Well, I think, as you also wrote in your newsletter this morning, Ryan, it's also likely not to be very effective, which ultimately, in a good capitalist way, might solve the problem sooner rather than later. But I take the point, Ryan, that you had, and Karen, I wonder if is Washington seeing sort of these climate crises, these events as interconnected, as in fact being part of the larger climate story, and is Washington finally coming to the idea that this is something that needs to be addressed? It's no longer a political football, or are we still stuck in the same place we've been stuck for a very long time, which is that, some people say sometimes the climate changes and it rains, and sometimes the climate changes and it's hot, but that's just the way it is, and let's just get on with life.
I think the answer to that is yes, and it's no. Yes, the Inflation Reduction Act passed. It has almost $400 billion in it that gives incentives to private companies to produce more renewable energy, for households to use less energy, and more renewables. It addresses electric vehicles, the oil and gas industry. That's the yes part. The no part is that not a single Republican voted for any of it. It only won in the Senate by one vote because the vice president went in and broke a tie. And you can say, yes, this is the biggest climate move to address climate change ever. It kind of, catches up the Americans to where the Europeans were when the EU very proudly passed all of its measures. Of course, they're now saying, as Stefan has said, oh my God, what are we going to do? And the U.S. is now stepping forward. But as everybody knows, we've got midterm elections coming up in November. We've got nationwide elections coming up in 2024. The vote's going to be very close in both of them, and there's no telling what's going to happen in the future. For now, yeah, they've taken a very big step. How long that will last, who knows?
Well, unfortunately, I think as this discussion sort of underscores, politics is slower than Mother Nature wants us to move when it comes to the issue of climate change, and somehow we're all going to be living with the consequences. Though we are of an age where it's more likely that our kids are going to be living with those consequences and our grandkids than us, unfortunately. Hopefully I'm wrong on that. Ryan, speaking of age, turns out if you're a young prime minister in Finland and having an evening off with your friends, that can lead to almost becoming a political crisis. And I wonder, first of all, tell us what this hubbub is all about. But secondly, is the reality that we have now, in fact, young women, and they tend to be women coming to power in a whole variety of places, leading the media to address these issues in different ways that they would have never have done with slightly older men who are also known for partying and dancing deep in the night. They're just not videoed all the time.
Indeed. Well, in Silvio Berlusconi's case, sometimes they are. There are some national and global touchstone elements to this story. So I will give the quick background and hope that whoever's doing the lawn mowing in my background doesn't interrupt your experience of it. So in Finland, it's a very parsimonious culture, I would say. So Sanna Marin is someone who brought a touch of glamour and excitement to a political culture that is fairly austere. And that made her more popular than the other figures in her government, more popular than her party. And when you are in that position, you're also someone who's vulnerable to political takedowns. And so when she has done things like charge breakfast to the taxpayer, or use a government car to turn up to dinners and nightclubs and so on, for some people, that already puts Sanna Marin on thin ice. And then what's happened recently is there's been a series of videos and photos come out of her partying at nightclubs, partying in her own prime ministerial country residence. And that has not gone down well with people who often of a different generation, often male, but, you know, it's comes from across the political spectrum. Some people consider this is poor judgment. Someone who is taking her country into NATO, who faces threats directly on its border from Russia, isn't someone who should be out getting hammered at a nightclub at 4 a.m. Now, we might say that that is a total double standard. Winston Churchill spent most of World War II less than sober and did a pretty good job. There are certainly other men that take their whiskey in ways that might not be considered entirely sober either. Sanna Marin's passed her drug test. She's come forward and said, look, I'm a human. I deserve a night off as well. But really, it comes down to a sense of, is this a gender double standard? Are there generational values differences at play here? And did she have good judgment? You know, I have known Jacinda Ardern for 20 years. I have been to nightclubs with Jacinda Ardern. I cannot imagine Jacinda Ardern would do that while Prime Minister of New Zealand. So there's a lot of different angles here, but I am quite sympathetic, like, to the idea that a leader can have a night off if it's organized in the right way. And we've still got some question marks over that.
Stefan, you've covered a woman leader for a long time, Angela Merkel. You wrote her biography. She's, I don't think, ever caught going to nightclubs, so that was not. But that was not an issue. But you have younger leaders are happening all over the place. So you have a very a young foreign minister right now from the Greens. How is this playing in Germany, or is it generally ignored? And what's your view on how the media should be thinking about covering changing generations as they come to power?
Well, it's a huge issue. It's has an impact on everyone. Everyone has an opinion on it. There's no other story being read that ferociously as that one. We should try to avoid to frame this as a generational issue. I think this is a big mistake because then you run in a trap, and there's no reason at all to either deny an old prime minister dancing and either a young one. So this is, as Ryan says, they should do as they please in their nights off. The question is, how does that impact on your role in office, and how do you actually frame sort of a public perception of yourself? And the Finnish prime minister actually has a long track record of framing herself as being this young and lively and youthful and I should say so, taking political life extremely easily. And the discrepancy between sort of the burden of office and her easygoing basically makes that story run. This is what people find so impressive. How can you handle such a burdenful job as a prime minister by partying actually rather offensively as she does? And the pictures are a little bit more than dancing, I would say. But even that I would sort of not judge. The only thing to judge is her judgment ability. And this is where Ryan is totally right. Is she well advised to basically foster that picture of herself and then inviting friends, as she calls them, in her office, who get photographed half naked in official residence? That's poor judgment. I mean, Annalena Baerbock would get the same heat if that would happen in Germany. But then again, I totally agree. There is some double standards in the game if there's a young woman involved. And that's Sylvia Hearn's experience. This is now the Finnish experience. This is Annalena Baerbock's experience. She's running #1 in the polls in Germany because she's a young woman, gets that much attention. So young women do have it extremely more difficult because they get all this attention. There seem to be sort of this kind of attractiveness that they appeal they do have is also working against them. And we should really try to separate those substantial things from age and gender issues.
Karen, how do you see it, both from a journalism perspective, and of course, the United States has only leaders in their 70s and 80s in both parties, so that's not a problem. Although I would point out that who was the person who was the youngest member of Congress, AOC, Alexandra Cortez, who is also treated to the same kind of standard about how she has been judged by society. I think it's not just the media as such. But how do you see this?
Well, it's interesting that at AOC, she got hammered for a video that was taken long before she was even in office, where she was just doing a dance on the roof of her apartment building.
By the way, great video.
Yeah, it was a parody of I can't remember the name of the movie, Breakfast Time, and but I think that was only one of the many things that she was criticized for. I may be out of it, but I mean, I've seen the videos of the Finnish videos, but I haven't seen that become a huge issue in this country. God knows we have enough huge issues of our own that have to do with bias, and whether it's age bias or gender bias or any kind of bias. So I haven't seen it be a big thing. I find it interesting that Scandinavia in particular has so many elected women. I mean, I remember years ago when national magazines put on their covers the government of Iceland, which at the time every single person in the cabinet was a woman in the government. So I think that it's not. I don't think it's so big an issue here. I think that AOC was attacked for political reasons, and that was just one of the things that they got to get her for political reasons. I'm not sure that that's the case. That's the case here. So
I think it's partly also the political reasons is behind what's happening in the Marin case, but it points to a larger issue. And Stefan, let me because you raised it with us in our conversations prior to getting online. I mean, there is this worry about what's happening domestically in certain countries, including in the United States, where we're in the middle of a really, really tough legal issue with a former president, midterm elections that we don't know quite where they will end, and sort of the impact that these issues have on the ability of countries to continue to have a predictable foreign policy. I think that's part of what's happening in the Sanna Marin case is sort of you have really serious business happening and you're having fun, which is fine. You're going to have fun, but how does that affect the ability of the country to conduct itself in these times? How worried are people in Europe, in particular, with regard to the American political situation, as we see the kinds of things that we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks?
Well, the worry is growing constantly. Every little note coming out of Mar-a-Lago is taken notice. I hear we're all awaiting the opening of the files in a couple of hours, I think. So that's the disclosure of those files. Donald Trump is a constant nightmare who's out there to return, and this is worrying Europe because it all comes into basically all the issues we're discussing now, from the war to energy to climate. He stands for backlash. He stands for exactly the opposite to what sort of the sane minds governing most of Europe at this point would like to happen. So there's a huge worry that America would leave course again and would be obsessed with its own problems, which are huge. I agree, currency is a tremendously problematic issue. But so this is why this is perceived as an ultimate fight, and we'll know by November who succeeds. I think his fate will be decided in the next week, whether he can be nailed down legally or not. And otherwise, well, we'll might have him back.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think his fate's going to be sealed this week or next week or the week after. This is a story that is only just beginning, and it's the affidavit that will be a redacted version that is about to be released. And we'll just raise more questions, and we'll give more journalists time to delve into it. But it is, I think, the worry behind it is exactly the concern that folks have everywhere. And Ryan, I mean, this issue of credibility, and you do have this sense of impending doom that sort of hangs over almost every conversation of international affairs when it comes to the future American role in the world. Is that justified? Is that the right way to think about it? And how do you reassure people that in fact politics will just be politics and we'll get on just like a party is a party and things will move forward?
Yeah, I think it would be a mistake to say everything is going back to some old normal. I think what Trump definitely sealed into foreign understanding of America is that it's not always going to be dependable in the ways that existed for the 50 years after World War II. So I think that the only way to deal with that is to further organize and cement alliances so that even if one part of the alliance isn't being dependable or isn't predictable, the rest of the alliance network is more organized and functional. It's almost the only thing you can do. One other example where I think that is on this theme of domestic troubles potentially affecting foreign policy in the rest of the world. Italy is due to go to elections end of September. We don't have time to discuss it in detail, but I do think Giorgia Meloni, the far-right leader who's likely to become the next prime minister, dependent on two friends of Putin, Matteo Salvini and Silvio Berlusconi. She's super interesting in an American context because I think she's helping to create a playbook for candidates not called Trump, the kind of smarter Trumps, as people interested in foreign policy might think of it. So people who have radical right-wing nationalist positions on a lot of issues to the extent that they can be domestic focused, but who have a stronger commitment to transatlantic alliance and international institutions than Trump ever did. So Giorgia Meloni getting up and being able to succeed in an EU context gives a bit of a playbook to people like Ron DeSantis on how to give red meat to the MAGA crowd without being Donald Trump.
Fascinating. We'll be watching that election, which is indeed a very interesting election. And Giorgia Meloni is a very interesting candidate with great care. I just final word. You speak to an alliance man's heart when you think that alliances can solve our future problems. So hope you're right. Whether or not you're right, we will be able to look at it again next week when we'll be back with another edition of World Review. Till then, I want to thank Karen DeYoung, Stefan Kornelius, and Ryan Heath for their insights this week. Thanks so much. Excellent conversation. Look forward to having you back on soon. And until then, I want to thank our viewers and listeners. Tune in again next week for another edition of World Review. Until then, bon weekend.